Shabbat Shalom. We are today looking at Shabbat, Mishpatin, and the Parsha for Mishpatin, which is from the book of Shemot. The word Mishpatin is the plural of Mishpat, which we don't actually see that often, but it's translated as rules or ordinances. Parsha Mishpatim is the source of 53 of the 613 commandments, specifying 23 affirmative or prescriptive mitzvot, things that we are to do, and 30 prohibitive commands, things that we're not supposed to do. This reading, following immediately upon God's revelation at Sinai, is really an expansion of the more general 10 sayings, or more commonly called the 10 commandments. The prescriptive commandments offer the average son or daughter of Israel, that is us, instruction as to how to live each day in righteousness before Hashem. That is the full intention of these commandments. There is no discussion of salvation here. This is simply a matter of pleasing God. If you want to please God, then these are the commandments that He wants us to obey, to live a righteous life. So here we have a comprehensive and workable code of conduct for the newly established covenant nation of God, Israel. Up until this time, although our people walked with God to some degree, they have never had the directives given to them, which are given here. Specific directives rather than general ones. And so here we have the extrapolation of the 10 sayings. And this includes laws for all kinds of things, such as how Hebrew servants are to be treated. They're not to be treated like most people probably treated their servants in those days. They were to be treated with kindness and as brothers and sisters. In addition, we have an explanation of the distinction between premeditated murder and other forms of homicide, manslaughter, for example. We have those distinctions commonly understood in law today, but that has not been true until quite recently. Directives as to how one should show respect to one's parents, laws relating to the heinous act of kidnapping, rulings concerning injury inflicted on a pregnant woman resulting in a miscarriage, the legal ramifications of personal injury and damages. Did you know that was in Torah? Yes, it is. The meaning of sexual morality which is in accordance with God's standards, not subjective and not changeable. There are stringent laws opposing all forms of witchcraft or divination. And finally, one of the important ones, one that we refer to over and over again through the prophets, the obligations of the Bnei Israel to strangers, that is, sojourners, people living within their lands who were not Jews, widows, and orphans. And the list goes on. to discuss proper conduct relating to loans and securities, prohibition against using God's name in vain, that is, using his name for anything but praise and worship of him, or speaking ill of judges and leaders. God's requirements for personal tithing. A tenth of everything belonged to God, and it still does. The sanctity of firstborn sons and animals. And of course, we have a ceremony called Pidyon haben, which is the redemption of the firstborn son, which is still carried out today. Prohibition against eating prey animals and birds, any kind of animal that eats other animals. Laws concerning witnesses and the judiciary system, with a strong warning against standing with the majority in a perversion of justice. Very important. The command to restore lost property and to assist in unburdening an animal in distress. In other words, against cruelty of any kind to animals. Injunctions relating to the sabbatical years and to Shabbat itself. A prohibition against mentioning the names of foreign deities. So we were not supposed to use Hashem's name in any way other than praise, but we also were not to use the names of other gods, to call upon them in any way, or to use them even in conversation. The command to observe the Aliyah festivals is again a very important one, and there are regulations given about Pesach offerings and first fruits. So relating to Shavuot, and a prohibition given 3 times in Torah against boiling a kid in its mother's milk. This relates to idolatrous practices of the time. In the midst of these commands, Hashem reminds and reassures us of his providential care and of his continuous angelic protection. We're surrounded by angels. He protects us. He's with us all the time. As part of this covenant, Israel will receive God's many blessings as her people obediently follow God's commandments. In some ways, this could be seen easily as cause and effect. If we do what God says, then we will live the kind of lives that will be blessed. Israel will successfully conquer the land of promise, and the boundaries are described here, but only if her people do not enter into covenants either with the indigenous people of Canaan or with the gods they worship. And when all this had been said, our people unanimously ratified the covenant with the affirmation of Na'aseh v'nishma. All that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do. Remembered and quoted frequently as we will do and we will obey. Our commitment to the covenant relationship that he had established with us. This Torah reading offers one of 2 presentations of what is commonly known as the 10 words or the 10 sayings. These 3 words, Anoki Havaya Elokecha, I am God your Lord, introduce the 10 sayings. The word Havaya refers to God's transcendence. Elohecha speaks of his immanence, his divine presence, which is manifested in the physical world. It has been said that Anoki is actually an acronym for these words, Ana Nafshi Kavit Yavet, meaning I, God, wrote or expressed the essence of my soul and gave it to you, the Jewish people, in the Torah. Anoki. Here we unwrap the heart and the essence of the one and only God, and that is holiness. In the holiness code of Vayikra chapters 17 through 26, we have a parallel with Parsha Mishpatim, emphasizing the nature of God's commandments as holy. We are to be holy because our God is holy. Most other deities were known for their cruelty, their capriciousness, and their immorality. Look at the Greek or Roman gods. I mean, unbelievable things took place, almost as if because the gods did these things, it was okay for everyone else to do them too. Incest and rape and all kinds of things like that. This was commonplace among the deities of the pagans. But our God is a holy God. And the implication is that holiness, the key attribute of Hashem, is only attainable through obedience to God's Mishpatim. And again, this is not about salvation, but about the basis of our personal relationship with God. So, why did God give us the Torah? Torah provided our people with a code of conduct, a legal system, but also a personal code of conduct. Our God in his perfection is the standard for holiness. His Mishpatim enable us to aspire to that standard of holiness and righteousness and sanctification. These laws were the very first of their kind, literally the only ones of their kind. They were unique in every way. Within them, there was no discrimination between the wealthy and the poor, between classes or tribes, or even between male and female, something quite unheard of in the world of that day, and frankly, in the world of most days. In fact, no other legal system offered fair treatment or anything approaching equality before the law. And I will remind you that not until the 19th century, did human beings begin to establish legal systems which in any way came close to that of Torah. And these systems, like the Napoleonic in France and the goals of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternity, owe their stand for equality directly to Torah. A great deal is said about Greek law and standards, but in fact, their laws did not establish anything like equality. They had slaves. In fact, if you looked at Athens, the majority of the people living there were slaves. The great philosopher of Greece, Plato, in his work, The Republic, presents an elite which rules and everyone else who knows his or her place. And that's the way the world was until well into the 19th century. Some people think that's the way the world is today. Torah teaches that all human beings have a personal responsibility and obligation to Hashem, and that God has rightful expectations of us, those he has created. Specifically, God has expectations of the one people that he created from Abraham and Sarah, Israel. Throughout the scriptures, God promises chastening when our people turn away from their covenant promises to him, as we read in the Haftorah. God clearly indicated in the 10 sayings that honoring and obeying him comes first. And this is the basis of all the other commandments. And that living righteous lives impacts our life as well as our relationships with others. The commandments of God are like the fence of a corral where young horses are trained. Like young horses, we can harm ourselves or others if we act in accordance with our whims, our desires, or our fears. God has given us his Mishpatim in order to direct us and guide us. God has given us these to protect us, to make our lives peaceful and productive, showing us the best way to live and to deal righteously with others. This is halakha, literally the way or the path. And so it's not surprising that Rav Yeshua described himself as the way, the truth, and the life, since as giver of Torah, he alone of those who walked the earth lived it out fully. Rav Shaul refers to himself as a follower of the way in his explanation to Agrippa and Festus. In our Ketuvim B'Meshikim reading, Mark 12, a Torah teacher came to Rav Yeshua. Of course, he was familiar with all of the Mishpatim, but he came with this question: which is the most important mitzvah of them all? I know the commandments, but which one is the most important? Some of those who came to question him hoped to test his intellect, his knowledge, his ability to speak. This was a common practice, of course. You would go to someone else's rabbi, and you would ask him questions to see how he stacked up against your rabbi, or to trap him into an obvious error. But this questioner had an honest desire to know the truth. And of course, Rav Yeshua knew that. This man wanted to know what Rav Yeshua actually believed. He wanted the answer. And so from the Torah, Rav Yeshua answers with words that everyone listening understood and accepted. The most important is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Taken, of course, from Devarim 6, verses 4 through 5. Wow. No one could argue with that. How could you possibly, as a Jew, argue with that? Rav Yeshua also quoted from the Vahavta, "You are to love Adonai your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your understanding, and with all your strength." And he added from Vayikra 19:18, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you." None of this was new. Rav Yeshua answered in this way because the Mishpatim of Torah provides the blueprint for a righteous relationship with Hashem. Earlier, in what is called the Sermon on the Mount, Rav Yeshua declared, "Don't think that I have come to abolish the Torah and the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to bring to fruition. Until heaven and earth pass away, not so much as a yod or a stroke of a letter will pass from the Torah until everything that must happen has happened. And whoever disobeys the least of these mitzvot." Now listen to this carefully. "Whosoever disobeys the least of these mitzvot and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys them and so teaches will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." These are the words of Rav Yeshua, Mashiach Yeshua. Unless your righteousness, he's saying to his Talmudim, unless your righteousness is far greater than that of the Torah teachers and the Pharisees, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. The first statement says you will be least in the kingdom. The second statement says you will not be there. Rav Yeshua was rebuking those of his day who, in their desire to create a ring around the Torah, had altered commandments given by God or added to them. But he is also rebuking those who, like many of our own day, reduce the commandments of Torah to ashes and sweep them into the dustbin. Rav Yeshua's teachings, following his conversation with the Torah teacher, offer further insights into his perspective on the exalted position of Torah. In Luke 12:38 and through 40 and other passages, Rav Yeshua provides negative examples, those who fail to keep Torah. He spoke of rabbis who like to walk around in robes and be greeted differentially in the marketplace, using their position or their apparent piety to gain admiration. And he mentions those, mostly the wealthy, who like to have the best seats in the synagogue and take the places of honor at banquets. In many cases, these were the very people who broke the commandments by their treatment of widows and orphans. Obviously, according to Rav Yeshua, godliness is demonstrated in action as one does mitzvot, rather than by a show of piety. It's by our actions and not our words. In Luke 12:41 through 44, we have this positive example noted for our attention by Rav Yeshua. As Rav Yeshua and his Talmudim were at the temple, they watched, and rich people came by, putting large sums into the temple treasury, making a great show of following the Mishpatin. And then a very poor widow came along, and she put in 2 small coins. Rav Yeshua said, "Look at that." He pointed to this woman. He drew attention to this act of genuine piety, saying, this widow has put in more than all the others making donations. His Talmudim clearly didn't understand, because surely the widow had given little to the upkeep of the temple, while others had given huge sums which would provide for the livings of the Kohanim and for the constant repairs needed in the Mikdash. But Rav Yeshua pointed out that the wealthy had contributed a tithe of their wealth, which they would not miss. The widow had given more than required. In fact, she had given everything she had in order to honor God and to demonstrate her love for him. And so we see that God's Mishpatim are incumbent upon everyone. Why would God deny his own commandments? Is God a man that he changes his mind? Do we not say Hashem is the same yesterday, today, and forever? Well, surely if he changed his mind about these commandments, that could not be true. Those who have a personal relationship with God through the atonement of Mashiach Yeshua should be the first to desire to obey God. Rav Yeshua was speaking directly to those who would call themselves his followers down through the ages. A Talmid is subject to the teaching of his or her rabbi. A Talmid takes upon himself the lifestyle of his or her rabbi. If our rabbi is Rav Yeshua, he lived and died as a Torah-observant Jew. This is the paradigm, the example to which we are told to be conformed according to Rav Shaul. On the subject of Mishpatim incumbent upon Talmudim, the conclusion has been drawn that the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 rejected the Torah commandments given by God, or at least they rejected them for those who come to faith in Mashiach Yeshua from among the Goyim, people who today go on calling themselves Goyim. Strange. In fact, the council summarized the Mishpatim of the Holiness Code, Vayikra chapters 17 through 26, as the basic requirement for all new followers of Mashiach Yeshua from among the pagans. Rabbi Nosson Shirman, the general editor of the Art Scroll Metzora publications, comments on the Holiness Code The Jew's mission of holiness encompasses his entire being and all forms of his behavior. The Torah uses the term holiness specifically with regard to 3 areas: idolatry, sexual immorality, and forbidden foods. What did the council talk about? Idolatry, sexual immorality, and forbidden foods. The Holiness Code. These are the basic requirements set down by the Jerusalem Council, who had authority over all the followers of Yeshua, wherever they were. And these are what they said: prohibitions against sacrifices in the field. Vayikra 17 through 26, 17:5 and 7 specifies that these were sacrifices to demons. The second is eating meat with blood in it is forbidden, a reference to the method by which the animal was to be slaughtered. Shekita, Jewish ritual slaughter, minimizes the amount of blood left in the carcass and prevents inhumane treatment of animals. And third was prohibitions against forbidden sexual relationships. Some were important aspects of pagan worship. So these Mishpatim are not the beginning or the end of holiness in the Torah, nor could they be for the Shliachim at the council, but they lay the foundation of holy living for those from among the Goyim, for whom this was all new. Not like Cornelius, who was already in the process of conversion. The consequence for breaching the holiness code was being made kerit or keres, that is, cut off from the people of Israel. The Jerusalem Council, by stipulating these standards, clearly framed within Torah Mishpatim, set these new believers apart from pagan life and from the pagans around them. Additionally, there is the reminder that these new followers would hear the Mishpatim in the local synagogue, which it was incumbent upon them to attend. At a time when there were no synagogues, other than the one in Jerusalem, operated by followers of Yeshua. They were to go to the synagogue and hear the words of the Torah. Rather than offering new converts from among the Goyim a third way, Christianity, the council expected followers of Mashiach Yeshua to change their lifestyle, to attend synagogue, to learn Torah, and to assimilate into the people of Israel. The long-term goal of the council was forbidding pagan practices, requiring synagogue attendance, separating new converts from their pagan roots and joining them to Jewish roots, so that in time they would simply become part of Israel. Hashem is, as I said previously, immutable and unchanging, and thus the purpose of God never changes. He is not like the double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. What he proposed and chose for Abraham and his descendants through Yitzchak and Yaakov, he has set before all who desire to follow his ways. The terms and conditions have not changed. In Mashiach Yeshua, Torah was made flesh. The Mishpatim of God came to life. Mashiach Yeshua is the goal at which the Torah points. He is not the end of Torah. Rather, he is its living embodiment and the example to which we are to conform. As our people in the wilderness committed themselves to do and obey, in the same way, all Rav Yeshua's Talmudim must submit to Hashem's Mishpatim. The mitzvah of tithes and offerings, such as Yom HaBikurim and Sukkot, demonstrate recognition that everything belongs to God. The offering of Bikurim, first fruits, was chosen to express a basic principle that whatever is first is precious. Offering Bikurim, rather than offering only a tithe of the harvest, is a sign of submission, of servanthood and humility. The owner of the field or the tree deserves the first of its harvest. God commands us to remember when we are doing well that we have a tendency to become conceited, to think that it's all our own doing, and then to rebel against God's Mishpatim. Whatever our circumstances, we must never delude ourselves that it is by our own efforts that we accomplish anything of value. Whatever we bring to God, we must remember that it comes from God and ultimately belongs to Him. The demands of discipleship go beyond God's expectations in Torah. Yes, by bringing our Bikurim, we demonstrate that we have not forgotten the source of our redemption and blessing. Our thanksgiving to God should be tangible, seen not only in words, but in our actions. We bring our offerings as a sign of complete submission to God, as in the days of feudalism, when a serf brought the very best portion of his crop to his lord because he was the owner of the field. We give not only the fruit of our labors, but of our talents, our energy, and our time, of ourselves. God tells us, "You shall come to the Cohen, who will be in those days." Why does he say that? Well, time brings change. God wanted his people to bring their gifts to the spiritual authority he would establish in whatever day in which they lived. In those days, in these days, when the temple is not standing. Beyond this, it's clear that God intended his people to receive his direction and continue to offer their gifts through leaders of each generation, which he would raise up. Leaders are not to be compared to one another. Submission to leadership is a sign of submission to God. Rebellion against leadership is a sure sign of rebellion against Hashem. This does not mean we always agree with leaders, only that we must submit to their God-directed authority, especially as they speak from the scriptures. In terms of humility, the words we speak to God should be spoken with a broken and contrite heart. We should come before Adonai with joyful and glad hearts. Singing and liturgy are both appropriate. Nothing encourages joy and gladness more than praise. Our response should be that of our people at Sinai. and faithful followers of Rav Yeshua, and without equivocation. Na'aseh v'nishma. All that God has spoken, we will faithfully do. Let us be true followers of Mashiach Yeshua and follow in the way of Torah, so that God will be pleased with our service, with our praise and our worship. May Hashem bless you today and through the week ahead. May you see good and have a blessed week.